Laudetur Jesus Christus, Vatican and World News.
In the headlines this Tuesday, January 12th, Pope Francis recalls the importance of personal relationships in healing and wellness in his message for the upcoming World Day of the Sick. U.S. bishops renew calls for the government to ban the federal death penalty as the first woman in 70 years faces execution, and Venezuela's bishops say the communist regime has left the nation poorer and mired in crisis. In the Vatican, I'm Devin Watkins. Pope Francis today released his message for next month's World Day of the Sick. The day, which will be celebrated on February 11th, was instituted by Pope St. John Paul II in 1992. In his message for this year's iteration, the Pope is calling for healing that is grounded in trust and interpersonal relationships between the sick and those who care for them. Robin Gomes reports.
The theme of this year's World Day of the Sick is, "You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers," a theme that calls for a trust-based relationship to guide care for the sick. According to Pope Francis, a society is all the more human to the degree that it cares effectively for its most frail and suffering members in a spirit of fraternal love. As a way to fight hypocrisy and self-idolatry, Jesus asks us to stop and listen, to establish a direct and personal relationship with others, to feel empathy and compassion, and to let their suffering become our own as we seek to serve them, the Pope says in his message for the 29th World Day of the Sick. The Pope warns Christians about the danger of self-idolatry when our faith is reduced to empty words and we are unconcerned with the lives and needs of others. The current pandemic, the Pope notes, has exacerbated inequalities in our healthcare systems and exposed inefficiencies in the care of the sick, with the elderly, weak, and vulnerable people not always granted access to care or in an equitable manner. The pandemic has also highlighted the dedication and generosity of healthcare personnel, volunteers, support staff, priests, men and women religious who chose not to look the other way, but to share the suffering of patients whom they saw as neighbors and members of our one human family. Such closeness, the Pope remarks, is a precious balm that provides support and consolation to the sick in their suffering. For a therapy to be effective, the Pope stresses, it must be relational, as it enables a holistic approach to the patient. The path of healing grounded in a trusting interpersonal relationship, he emphasizes, can help doctors, nurses, professionals and volunteers in caring for the sick. Jesus himself did this, the Pope says, not by magic, but as a result of an encounter, an interpersonal relationship. I'm Robin Gomes.
In other news, Democratic members of the U.S. House of Representatives say they will vote on articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump on Wednesday. They accuse him of inciting insurrection ahead of last week's siege on the Capitol. Representatives are also calling on Vice President Mike Pence to remove Mr. Trump from office using the 25th Amendment. Passage of the House bill would make Trump the only U.S. president to be impeached twice. A vote in favor would also force the Senate to hold a trial to decide whether to convict Trump, which would bar him from holding public office again. Separately, U.S. bishops are calling on the government to halt federal executions due to go ahead this week and are asking Congress to abolish the death penalty. As Lydia O'Kane reports, the move comes as a judge temporarily blocks the execution of the first woman to face the federal death penalty in 70 years.
With 3 more federal executions scheduled in January, the chairman of the U.S. Bishops' Domestic Justice and Human Development Committee, Archbishop Paul Coakley of Oklahoma, and Archbishop Joseph F. Naumann of Kansas City have renewed their call to President Trump and the acting Attorney General to stop federal executions. In a statement, they also urged the new Congress and President-elect Joe Biden to make this a priority. In addition, they ask President-elect Biden to declare a moratorium on federal executions and to commute current federal death sentences to terms of imprisonment. In a letter to every member of the U.S. Congress, the bishops say the terrible loss suffered by victims' families must be considered as well. We encourage lawmakers to redirect the energy and resources that currently go towards executions to provide compassionate and professional assistance to the families of victims. They also note that successive popes from St. John Paul II to Pope Francis have called for an end to the death penalty in the United States and around the world. The bishops point out that every person is created created in the image and likeness of God. They say we encourage everyone to work to rid the death penalty from our state and federal laws and to develop greater appreciation for the sacred dignity of every human life. This latest plea by the bishops follows a year in which the federal government for the first time executed more people than all 50 states combined. Among those who are due to be executed this week is Lisa Montgomery. She was scheduled to die by lethal injection on Tuesday. However, a judge has now granted her a stay of execution to decide whether she is competent to be put to death on mental health grounds. Montgomery was sentenced to death for killing 23-year-old pregnant woman Bobby Jo Stinnett at her home in Missouri before cutting out and kidnapping her baby. Another death row inmate who is due to die by lethal injection is Corey Johnson. His execution is set for the 14th of January. I'm Lydia O'Kane.
Indonesian divers today retrieved the flight data recorder of Sriwijaya airplane that crashed with 62 people on board at the weekend. Divers also found a separate radio beacon, raising hopes that the cockpit voice recorder could soon be found and reveal what caused the plane to lose control moments after takeoff. With few immediate clues on what happened after takeoff, investigators will rely heavily on the flight recorders to determine what went wrong. Venezuela's Catholic bishops have condemned the communist regime of Nicolas Maduro of leaving the Latin American nation seriously impoverished. In a pastoral letter, the bishops addressed a host of issues ranging from human rights violations to the harassment of migrants attempting to flee the country. Christopher Wells has the story.
The bishop's exhortation describes the so-called parliamentary elections of December 6th as an event plagued by serious irregularities and low turnout, which remains unrecognized by large sectors of the international community. The results of the election do not express the will of the people, nor do they reflect social pluralism, the bishops say. The people of Venezuela, they continue, are suffering the dire consequences of an economic model imposed by a communist-style regime and ideology which has impoverished everyone, especially the weakest. In their exhortation, the bishops also criticized the wrongly named Plan for the Fatherland, which seeks to impose laws to create a communal state, led by people who have not accepted the responsibility or the ethical demands that come with being in government. The bishops also denounced the persistent violation of human rights guaranteed by the national constitution. These rights, they say, have been disregarded by the very people who wrote the Constitution, and those who insist upon their rights become victims of persecution. The pastoral exhortation laments the deterioration of quality of life, education, health, and basic services, as well as unstoppable inflation and devaluation that has impoverished the entire population. These problems have led to increased forced migration, which instead of being protected is subject to harassment by police and military forces, the bishops say. This migration, they add, is the most obvious proof of the great failure of public policies, economic and social, being implemented by the government. Because the whole country is suffering due to the terrible crisis it is going through, humanitarian aid cannot be politicized, the bishops insist. The Bishops' Conference message concludes with an invitation to participate in a national day of prayer and reflection on February 2nd, to remain strengthened in God and to ask for a peaceful resolution of conflicts. I'm Christopher Wells.
Uganda today banned social media and messaging apps just 2 days ahead of a presidential election. The vote pits Yoweri Museveni, one of Africa's longest-serving leaders, against opposition frontrunner Bobi Wine, a popular singer. Users complained on Tuesday that they were unable to access Facebook and WhatsApp. Both social media platforms are being widely used for campaigning by all sides ahead of Thursday's election in the East African country. Campaigning ahead of the vote has been marred by brutal crackdowns on opposition rallies, but rights groups say the restrictions are a pretext for muzzling the opposition. Elsewhere, the European Union has warned Iran that the nation's decision to ramp up uranium enrichment could scupper attempts to keep the deal alive. EU Policy Chief Josep Borrell said Iran's intention to enrich uranium up to 20% presents serious concerns. Stefan Boss reports.
European Union Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell, who supervises the agreement aimed at curbing Iran's nuclear capabilities, has expressed concern about Tehran's ambitions. In a statement, Borrell called Iran's intention to enrich uranium up to 20% at the Fordo underground nuclear facility a very serious development and a matter of deep concern. He added that this could have, in his words, very severe proliferation implications. Borrell stressed that full and timely cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency remains critical. Last week, Iran began enriching uranium to levels unseen since a nuclear deal was struck in 2015. The agreement offers Iran economic incentives in exchange for curbs on its nuclear program. But outgoing U.S. President Donald Trump abandoned the deal, and with the reinstatement of American sanctions, the other signatories, China, France, Germany, Russia and Britain, have struggled to provide Iran the assistance it seeks. And Iran has even argued that it is no longer obliged to respect limits laid out in the pact. Tehran claims President Trump violated it first by pulling the U.S. out of the deal in 2018, which resulted in crippling sanctions on Iran's already troubled economy. Despite Iran's actions, EU spokesman Peter Stano says Tehran continues to give inspectors full access to its nuclear sites. The standoff with Iran comes amid hopes within the EU that the United States, under the incoming administration of declared President-elect Joe Biden, will become part of the nuclear deal with Iran again. For Vatican News, I am Stefan Bos, reporting.
In Germany, the local Catholic bishops have repeated the church's opposition to medically assisted suicide. The rebuke comes in response to an article calling on church ministers not to rule out euthanasia when counseling people who are dying. Germany's bishops say assisted suicide is ethically unacceptable and add that death should be met with the Christian virtue of hope. Francesca Merlo has more.
From a Christian point of view, assisted suicide is not an ethically acceptable option, the German Bishops' Conference spokesman has reiterated. He continues saying that people's freedom to decide for themselves at every stage of their life according to their personal ideas is very important, and this applies to death too, providing the rule of law is respected. However, this does not make suicide an ethically acceptable option, the German bishop spokesman stresses, also reminding that research shows that the desire to end one's life is in most cases a result of fear, despair resulting from extreme situations, and therefore cannot be understood as the expression of self-determination. For this reason, he says, the desire to commit suicide cannot be accepted without asking questions, nor considered as a normal form of death. On the contrary, it is precisely in these highly dramatic situations of life that respect of self-determination requires a special observation and an empathic attention. The spokesman therefore reiterates that, according to the Church, allowing assisted suicide is not the right answer to the problem. What is needed in these situations is not a help to die, but rather support to develop prospects of life. He also points out the risks of all ill people being pressurized to give their consent to assisted suicide so as not to be a burden to others. This must not happen, he says. Referring to the pastoral care for people with suicidal thoughts, COP further emphasizes that it cannot be neutral. It approaches each person with an open mind while at the same time giving a Christian message of hope and is always on the side of life, he says. Euthanasia in Germany is illegal according to the German constitution. However, in February last year, the Federal Constitutional Court of Karlsruhe allowed pro-euthanasia associations that help people to commit suicide to publicize their activities. I'm Francesca Merlo.
That brings us to the end of this edition of Vatican and World News. For more on these and other stories, go to our web portal at www.vaticannews.va. There you can also find all our broadcasts in podcast form. And don't forget to catch the latest updates on our Facebook page and Twitter feed. In the Vatican, I'm Devin Watkins.